A man in his early 60s stood before Judge Frank Caprio, his uniform cap folded neatly under one arm. His hands trembled slightly, his back straight, his expression caught somewhere between dignity and shame. The charge was simple: shoplifting. The item he had taken? A pair of work gloves worth less than $20. As the clerk read the charge aloud, Judge Caprio's eyes stayed fixed on the man's face, weathered, tired, lined with years of labor and quiet endurance. There was something deeper there, something unspoken. The judge's voice softened as he asked, "Why would a veteran, a man who served his country, need to steal?" The man hesitated. His Adam's apple moved as he swallowed hard. Then his voice broke. "Your Honor," he said, "I needed them for a job interview. I couldn't afford to fail." The courtroom went still. No one moved. A simple shoplifting charge had suddenly become something very different, a window into a man's private war. What happened next would leave the courtroom speechless and prove that compassion, when used wisely, can be the highest form of justice. Before we go further, only 4% of viewers are subscribed. If you believe in fairness, kindness and second chances, hit that subscribe button now. Because what happens next will restore your faith in humanity. It was a grey morning in Providence Municipal Court. Outside, rain whispered against the windows, tracing uneven paths down the glass. The city beyond was a blur of headlights, umbrellas and puddles, but inside everything was hushed and still. The hum of conversation that usually filled the courtroom was replaced by something heavier: anticipation. People sat quietly in the back rows, waiting for their names to be called. Most were there for small matters, parking tickets, minor violations, the kind of things that come and go. But one case no one knew yet would change the tone of the entire day. Judge Frank Caprio sat behind the bench reviewing the docket. His glasses rested low on his nose, his expression calm but alert. He had seen countless faces pass through his courtroom, angry, desperate, careless, but he always approached each one with the same patience, the same hope that somewhere beneath the surface there was good to be found. The clerk called the next case. Case number 248, John Miller, shoplifting. A murmur rippled through the room. Shoplifting wasn't common in this courtroom, and the very word brought a faint shift of curiosity among those waiting. From the second row, John Miller rose. He walked slowly, carefully, as if every step carried the weight of years. His boots were worn and scuffed, his jacket faded from too many winters. Yet his posture remained straight, shoulders squared, a man who still carried the discipline of his youth. He stopped before the bench. His cap, a military veteran's cap, remained tucked under his arm. The judge looked up from the papers. "Shoplifting," Caprio repeated quietly. "Work gloves, is that correct?" "Yes, sir." The word was barely more than a whisper. The judge leaned back, eyes narrowing in quiet curiosity. He wasn't angry. He was searching. The air seemed to thicken as everyone waited for what would come next. No one expected that this ordinary case, a $20 theft, would soon turn into a story about survival, pride and compassion that would make headlines around the world. John Miller was 63 years old. His face carried the story of a lifetime. Deep lines across his forehead, silver streaks in his hair, and a stillness in his eyes that came from seeing too much. He spoke softly, each word measured, every "sir" carrying quiet respect. There was a humility in his presence, the kind that comes from years of working, serving, and losing quietly. John was a veteran of the U.S. Army, having served proudly during the early 1980s. He had never been decorated for heroics, but he had been dependable, the kind of soldier every unit relies on. After the service, he returned home, married his childhood sweetheart, and took a job at a local manufacturing plant in Providence. For 25 years he worked on the same floor at the same machine, his hands scarred but steady. He built a modest life, a small home, 2 children, a steady rhythm that felt like safety. But safety has a way of slipping away when you least expect it. When the factory closed, John was 57, too old to start fresh, too young to give up. He found odd jobs wherever he could, anything to stay afloat. His wife's health began to fail soon after, and within a few years cancer took her away. His children had long since moved out of state, each struggling with their own families, their own battles. By the time John turned 63, he was living alone, surviving paycheck to paycheck, clinging to the hope that one day something steady would return. Then one day, that hope arrived. A small opportunity. A warehouse job was hiring. The manager said he needed someone with experience. The position required safety gear, boots, helmet, gloves. John had everything except one thing: the gloves. That morning he walked into a hardware store. He moved slowly through the aisles, searching. When he saw the pair, durable, strong, the kind of gloves that felt like old times, he lifted the tag. $18.49. He reached into his pocket. $12. He stood there for a long time, fingers tracing the edge of the shelf. People walked by, not noticing the quiet storm inside him. It wasn't greed. It wasn't anger. It was desperation, the kind that whispers instead of shouts. He looked around. Then, quietly, he slipped the gloves into his jacket pocket. He walked toward the door, heart pounding in his chest. As he crossed the threshold, the security alarm beeped. The clerk called out, "Sir." John stopped immediately. He turned, reached into his coat and placed the gloves on the counter. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have done that." The clerk didn't know what to say. He just called the police. Later, when the officer escorted John to the station, he noticed something strange. The man didn't look angry or guilty. He looked tired. The officer asked, "Why'd you do it?" John answered quietly, "I just needed to work again." The officer wrote it down in his report. Days later, when Judge Caprio read those words, he paused. He knew this case was different. This wasn't about crime. It was about the quiet pain of a man who had been left behind. And as John stood before the bench that morning, the people in the courtroom began to realize the same thing. They weren't looking at a criminal. They were looking at a man who once wore a uniform for his country, a man who had served, sacrificed and survived, but somehow in the long stretch of years had become invisible to the very system he once defended. The air inside the courtroom grew heavy with unspoken sympathy. The sound of rain against the glass faded into silence as Judge Frank Caprio leaned forward, eyes fixed on John Miller. His tone was calm, yet the question carried weight. "Mr. Miller," he began gently, "why would a man like you steal something as small as a pair of gloves?" John shifted his weight, his gaze dropping to the floor. I made a mistake, Your Honor," he said, voice trembling. "What kind of mistake?" Caprio asked, leaning slightly closer. There was no anger in the judge's tone, only curiosity, patience, and the faint sadness of a man who'd seen too much pain walk through his courtroom doors. John's hands clenched around the brim of his cap. "So it wasn't for greed," he said. "It wasn't for anything bad. I just didn't have another choice." Caprio tilted his head, studying him. "There's always a choice, Mr. Miller, but sometimes the choices we're left with aren't fair. So I want to hear yours." A long pause filled the space between them. John took a deep breath, his voice thin but steady. "I had a job interview. Warehouse work. They told me to bring my own gear, helmet, boots, gloves. I had everything except the gloves. I thought maybe if I looked prepared, they'd take me seriously. I wanted to show them I could still do it." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Some people lowered their heads. Others looked away. There was no sound except the steady hum of the fluorescent lights. The judge nodded slowly. "And you couldn't ask anyone for help?" John gave a faint, almost embarrassed smile. "I've spent my life helping others. Asking for help. It's not something I'm good at." Caprio sighed softly. "Sometimes pride keeps us from asking for what we deserve, Mr. Miller, but pride won't pay the bills." John nodded, his jaw tight. "I know that now." He hesitated before continuing. "When you've been a soldier, Judge, you learn to handle things alone. You don't complain. You don't ask. You just get it done." The courtroom grew quiet again. Even the sound of the ceiling fan seemed to fade away. Judge Caprio leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. "You've carried a lot on your shoulders, haven't you?" John swallowed. "I guess I have. If this story already hits you," the judge said with a small, warm smile, "hit that like button, because what happens next will move you even more." The faintest chuckle passed through the audience, not out of humor, but out of relief. The tension was breaking, but only for a moment. Everyone knew something deeper was still coming. Judge Caprio folded his hands together and spoke quietly. "Mr. Miller, I'm going to ask you something personal. I want you to tell me." What were you really thinking in that store? John's lips parted slightly. He seemed caught between honesty and shame. Finally he spoke. I thought about my wife, he said. The courtroom stilled again. She used to tell me, John, you can lose everything, but don't lose your purpose. She believed work gave a man dignity. And I wanted to feel useful again. I didn't want to show up empty-handed and be told I was too old. I thought maybe if I looked the part, they'd hire me. His voice cracked. The words barely made it out. I just wanted to work again. He lowered his head, trying to hold back tears. There was a hush so deep it felt like the whole room was holding its breath. In the back row, a young woman dabbed at her eyes. One of the clerks looked down at her papers, blinking rapidly. Even the bailiff, a man built like stone, stood quietly, his expression softening. Judge Caprio's eyes glistened. Mr. Miller, he said gently, you served this country, didn't you? Yes, sir, Army, 1982 to 1988. The judge nodded. You've never been in trouble before? Never, sir. Caprio exhaled slowly. You've worked your whole life, haven't you? Yes, sir. Since I was 18, the judge leaned back. And now, after all these years, after all that service, you're standing here because you wanted to earn a living. John's eyes filled. Yes, sir. The judge paused for a long moment, the gravity of it all hanging in the air. Then he said softly but firmly, we live in a world where a man who's fought for freedom has to steal just to earn a living. That says more about the world than it does about you. A few quiet gasps echoed around the room. One man whispered to another, he's right. John's shoulders began to shake as he wiped his eyes. I didn't mean to do wrong, he whispered. I just wanted a chance. You don't have to explain anymore, Caprio said. I understand. There was something profoundly human in that exchange. Two men, from different generations and different worlds, connected by the understanding that sometimes doing wrong doesn't make you a bad person. It just makes you human. The judge glanced down at the report again, then looked back up. The store owner said you didn't resist, that you handed the gloves back and apologized? Yes, sir, Caprio nodded. You know, I've seen people steal for greed, for drugs, for thrill, but never for work, never to rebuild their life. The words echoed like a verdict. John lifted his eyes, surprised. You believe me? I do, said the judge, because I see it in your face. This isn't about theft. It's about dignity. The tension in the room gave way to something else, something softer, almost holy. A man in the back row began to clap quietly. Others joined him, hesitant at first, then louder. It wasn't applause for rebellion. It was for recognition. For a moment, the courtroom felt less like a place of judgment and more like a sanctuary. Judge Caprio smiled faintly and raised his hand for silence. Let's not turn my courtroom into a concert hall, he said with warmth, drawing a light laugh from the crowd. Then his voice softened again. Mr. Miller, I want you to listen to me carefully. You made a mistake, yes, but that doesn't define you. What defines you is what you've done with your life, and the fact that even after everything you still want to work. That's the kind of person this world needs more of. John's lips trembled as he whispered, Thank you, Judge. The judge leaned forward. Do you still want that job? John blinked, unsure. More than anything, sir. Caprio smiled. Then maybe, just maybe, today's the day that changes, the audience murmured again, sensing something extraordinary was coming. For the first time since the case began, John smiled faintly, not because he was free yet, but because for the first time in years, someone truly saw him. He stood a little taller, as though shedding the invisible weight of years of disappointment. His voice steadied. I don't know what to say, Judge. You don't have to say anything, Caprio replied. Just don't give up on yourself. Not today. Not ever. The courtroom was still. The moment lingered like the end of a prayer. Everyone there, and from the clerk to the spectators, knew they had just witnessed something that went beyond law, beyond rules. It was something simpler, something divine. The next few words from the judge would decide everything, and what came next would break the room's silence once and for all. The pause before the ruling felt like a held breath. Outside, the rain had slowed to a soft tapping, like fingertips on glass. Inside, every eye stayed fixed on the bench where Judge Frank Caprio studied the file. Then the man. Then the room that had fallen in love with a stranger's quiet courage. Mr. Miller, he began, voice steady, you stand here because of a mistake. But it was not a mistake born from malice. It was born from the stubborn desire to work. I cannot in good conscience brand you a criminal for that." A faint gasp broke from the benches. John swallowed, bracing himself, hands locked on the brim of his cap. "The charge is dismissed." The words landed like sunlight breaking through a storm. A soft roll of applause began, and then faded as the judge lifted a hand not to scold but to steady the moment. "But I don't want you leaving this room with just relief," he continued. "I want you leaving with direction. You don't walk out of here empty-handed. You walk out with a door to open." From the back row, a man in a work jacket stood, hesitant at first, then certain. "Your Honor," he called, eyes on John, "I run a logistics warehouse in Cranston. We need reliability more than anything. If Mr. Miller is willing, I'm willing." Every head turned. John blinked, stunned. The man nodded toward him, as though they'd known each other for years. "Gloves are on me," he added with a humble grin. "First day's Monday, if he wants it." John's breath hitched. He tried to speak, but emotion pushed the words back down. He pressed the cap against his chest and gave a small bow, the way soldiers sometimes thank without words. Judge Caprio leaned back, warmth lighting his face. "Providence," he said, almost to himself, "earning its name." The courtroom bloomed into applause again, sincere, grateful, human. Not victory over the law, but victory over indifference. A bailiff who'd seen a lifetime of anger and excuses stepped closer to the aisle and clapped quietly. Like a benediction. John approached the rail, and the warehouse owner stepped forward to meet him halfway. Their handshake was firm, unhurried, two palms promising to carry weight together. "We start early," the man said. "Say you'll hate the coffee. Love the crew." "I'll love the work," John answered, voice rough with tears. By the time he left the courtroom, people had stood to let him pass. An older woman reached out and squeezed his forearm. "You remind my family what decent looks like," she whispered. A teenager in a hoodie lifted a shy hand and said, "Good luck, sir." John nodded to both like a man collecting blessings for the road. He stepped into the rain, gentle now, almost friendly, and tilted his face toward it for a second longer than he needed. It washed nothing away, but it made everything feel possible. The following Monday, he arrived at the warehouse 10 minutes early. The air smelled of cold steel and forklift diesel. Someone handed him a set of safety earplugs, a badge on a blue lanyard, and a pair of brand-new gloves that still had the stiffness of hope. He flexed his fingers into them, and they creaked softly like boots breaking in on a long walk. Work returned to his life as if it had never left. Pallets on the dock. Inventory sheets with columns of little squares waiting for check marks. A radio crackling with nicknames and jokes and routes to load before lunch. He moved deliberately, the old rhythm waking up in his hands. By the second week, he knew every aisle's stubborn habits, the one whose labels always peeled, the corner where the floor dipped, the spot where the wind slipped through and raised goosebumps on winter mornings. He didn't talk much about court. He talked about process and time and safety. He showed a younger kid how to lift with his legs without sounding like a lecture. He marked a hazard with yellow tape and left the roll in plain sight, in case the next person needs a little extra. He kept his lunches simple, a thermos of coffee, an apple, half a sandwich. One Friday he brought donuts. Nothing fancy, mostly sugar and sincerity. Someone pinned a thank you note to the breakroom corkboard with a thumbtack that had lost its red cap. A local reporter called the warehouse to ask for comment. The manager told her the truth. He's the first one in, last one out. He shows up like the job is a promise. The story aired that night under a headline that traveled farther than anyone expected. Veteran cleared after shoplifting gloves, now mentoring new hires. Messages began to arrive at the court's public inbox, then at the warehouse, then in the mailroom where the envelopes were stacked, thin and thick, return addresses from places John had never seen. A retired teacher wrote, "Tell him I'm proud of him." A 9-year-old sent a drawing of a man in a hard hat with a gold star and the words, "You can do it." A woman from Nebraska enclosed a gift card with a note, "Just in case you ever need a second pair." The hardware store clerk stopped by the warehouse on his day off. He brought coffee and an apology that John refused like a gentleman refuses the last slice. "You did your job," John said. "Now I'll do mine." What spread online wasn't outrage. It was relief that mercy had done what punishment could not. Donations came in for a veterans' work gear fund, started by a group of strangers. who had only the internet and a good idea in common. A local union dropped off a crate of gloves with a label on the side for day ones and second chances. At the end of his first month, John stood in the locker area, staring at a small metal door with his name in tape across it. A locker of his own again, no grand prize, but proof. He put his cap on the top shelf, next to the gloves that now smelled faintly of machine oil and effort. He closed the door and the latch clicked like a line drawn under a sentence that had taken too long to write. Back in court a few weeks later, Judge Caprio read a brief update into the record, even though there was no legal reason to. "Mr. Miller is thriving," he announced. To those who wrote asking what justice looked like that day, "It looks like a time clock stamped at 6:58 a.m. And a man who knows he matters." He paused, then added softly, "May we all be lucky enough to be needed." If you felt the weight of that change, one quiet judgment turning into a life rebuilt, remember there's someone nearby who needs the same hand up. Stories like this travel because people carry them. And when they do, the next courtroom is already brighter. Some cases end with a number on a receipt and a stamp on a file. This one ended with a handshake and a start time. A pair of gloves sat at the center of it, cheap to buy, expensive to be without. They were never really the point. The point was what a man was willing to do to stand tall again, and what a community was willing to do to let him. Justice without compassion is a cold room. Compassion without responsibility is a door with no hinges. What happened here was different. The law didn't look away. It looked deeper. It asked not only what did you do, but also why. And when the answer came, raw and human, it met that answer with proportion, not pride. Friends, if you've ever felt invisible, remember this. The moment someone truly sees you can change everything. And if you've ever been the one doing the seeing, you already know, mercy is not weakness. Mercy is strength that remembers its own beginnings. Share this video if it restored your faith in humanity. Share it because someone you'll never meet is one story away from asking for help, one hand away from saying yes to Monday morning. Share it because the world is louder with anger than it is with kindness, and that imbalance is ours to fix. What do you think? Should a judge weigh the reason as carefully as the rule? If the answer is yes, how would you carry that into your own neighborhood, your workplace, your home? Like this video if you believe in kindness and justice. Subscribe for more true stories where law meets heart, where a small mercy pays a long wage, and where a pair of work gloves is sometimes the bravest thing in the room.